Good morning and welcome to this webinar, OCSF Decoded, Transforming the SOC Landscape for CISOs. This event, brought to you by Security Magazine, is sponsored by Hunters. I'm your moderator, Taylor Daughtery, Associate Editor of Security Magazine. Thanks for joining us. Today's presenters are Ian Forrest, Global VP of Solutions Engineering and Hunter Security, Oliver Rochford, Cyber Futurist and Strategic Advisor at Cyber Futurist, Yuval Itzakov, CTO at Hunter Security, and Jake Burkowski, Field CTO at Snowflake. Don't forget to submit your questions, and later in the program, our presenter will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived at securitymagazine.com. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's presenters, Oliver, Yuval, and Jake.
Great. Hi. As was mentioned, I'm Ian. I'm our VP of Solutions Engineering here at Hunters. And today I'm excited to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, OCSF. That's the Open Cybersecurity Schema Framework. Today we're going to cover the history of OCSF. So kind of how did we get here and why is OCSF being developed at all? Examples of what OCSF means for ingestion, data usability, analytics, search, data lakes, AI, and all the other things that you can think of. And we'll be discussing that topic with our great panel that have a lot of insight on OCSF from a variety of different aspects, some from Hunters and others as well. So let's go ahead and get those guys introduced. We have Oliver, Jake, and Yuval. Let's start with Oliver. Can you please quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, I started out my career as a pen tester working in SOCs before moving on to the vendor side, working for companies like Tenable, Qualys. So I've also worked for HP, Verizon, but I ended up at Gartner where I covered the SIEM Magic Quadrant, and I was also one of the analysts who named the SOAR market. So I kind of moved over more onto the, I would say, the strategic side. And since then, I've been working as an independent industry analyst as well, really just working with a lot of, end users trying to navigate this new world of AI, and also with startups trying to work out what users need.
Awesome. Thank you, Oliver. And Yuval, how about you introduce yourself next?
Yeah, so my name is Yuval Itzakov. I've been at Hunters for the past 5 years. Recently, I've become CTO of Hunters. Before that, I was 8 years at 8200 in IDF in Israel, building cybersecurity platforms, worked for various companies, mainly dealing with at the edge of security and data. And super excited to be here to talk about OCSF today.
Awesome. And last but not least, how about Jake? Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Good to meet everybody or see everyone here on this webinar. My name is Jake Burkowski. I'm Principal Cybersecurity Architect at Snowflake. I'm the Field CTO. I represent our cybersecurity observability workloads. For this, I was the CTO of a small cloud consultancy, built up a little cybersecurity practice. That's where I kind of came to understand and really like the concept of security data lakes. So when Snowflake decided they were going to launch cybersecurity as an official workload, and they were looking for a kind of technical leader to make up all the best practices because they didn't have them yet, that's where I came in. So really, really good to be here.
Awesome. Well, with that introduction of our illustrious panel, let's go ahead and get started with the conversation here. First, I think, Oliver, could you set the stage for us on OCSF, kind of why it was developed and what problem did it aim to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. I always think it helps to think a little bit about where we came from, and if you go back maybe 20, 30 years, we had the single intrusion detection system. Didn't matter what data came out of it because it was only you reading it anyway. You fast forward a little bit and we had a whole pool of these. We had firewalls and everything, and all of a sudden that problem of how do I exchange data and how do I make data searchable across different data sources became more and more acute. What we ended up with really, because there wasn't any kind of industry-wide standard, is that almost every single vendor, open source project developed their own. And as a consequence, if you were in the market of basically doing security analysis, doing security correlation like a SIEM vendor, the business you were really in was building parsers. And so if we go back maybe to 2012, 2014, you were paying a lot of money because that solution had parsers for all of the data sources you needed to get into a report. Not the best value if you think about it. More importantly, I think when the threat landscape turned really nasty, we were caught blindsided because all of a sudden we weren't really doing much useful stuff with that data, right? And if you think of what a vendor is doing, they have to not just build these parsers once, you have to maintain them. APIs change, data formats change, new technologies come on board. It turns into a thing. We've had multiple attempts at people trying to solve this problem, right? We've had other standards come out in the past, going back to the last wave of platform portfolio kind of providers. We had McAfee who tried to bring something like this out with their, they had a really cool approach to it as well. The problem is that you need to get competitors to buy into it. So you need to open up really widely. And the closest we came to it was actually CEF, Common Event Format, by ArcSide. Lots of people actually used it, and people don't realize this. That's what enabled the SIEM market, because ArcSide came along. They said, right, everybody else builds CEF, and if you were coming in as a new vendor, you didn't have to build 1 million parsers. You could start with a CEF parser, and that would allow you to basically get a foot in the market, much to the cost of ArcSide in the long run, but that's a different question, But it shows you how difficult it is, why companies struggle to build a standard and then let go. You've invested so much into it. Of course, at some point, though, we've come into a position now where we have very neutral providers. I would say almost agnostic people who are able to push a standard like this. And when we look at OCSF, the driving force behind it really is Amazon AWS, right? Those were the people who initiated it. And I think what amazed me about OCSF, when I knew it was a big standard, is when I saw competitors adopting it. That to me was the big, that big trigger moment where I thought, right, this is going to take off. And that's where we are today, over 180 contributors. But what is OCSF? Why is it a big deal? And it's really a framework which allows you to create different data schemas. And what's a schema? A schema is basically a description of how your data should be called, how it should be, and also how it should be generally stored and described. And I'll give you an example: IP address. You'd think IP address is pretty easy, but actually you can spell IP address with a hyphen or without. The problem is if you're trying to get a data source and someone's done it differently to you, all of your analytics break, all of your searching breaks. And that's what basically a schema framework solves for you. It tells you in advance, if I use an IP address, this is what I should call it, and this is how it should look. And that makes it predictable for everybody. It means that data engineers, threat hunters, security analysts, detection engineers are all speaking the same language, and it's all predictable at a high level, But the goal is to make it basically, democratize and make it available to everybody. So that's where we're at now, right? So now we have this great standard. There's 180 plus adopters. People are starting to use it, but of course, what's interesting about this, and I think this is where Hunters is very unique, is that while a lot of vendors have adopted it, they aren't really using it natively. And what I mean by that is you can convert to OCSF, but under the bonnet, they're still using their old data model. And so I think this is the next wave of OCSF adoption, where people actually say, no, we're going to adopt this as a native standard. And that's where we are today, right? So, and I'll hand back to you guys then. But that's kind of the rundown of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's super exciting. I think you mentioned a couple of things, about building parsers, and I've spent the last 5+ years of my career working with SIEM and SOAR products, and I can't tell you how many parsers I've built and broke and then rebuilt and then broke again. So it definitely speaks to me. That's why I said earlier, it's near and dear to my heart. But I appreciate that background. It's really helpful to kind of understand how we got to where we are and what we're trying to solve. With that being said, each of you kind of work in the security space, working with security professionals, and you hear about their challenges on a regular basis. So at a high level, how do you see OCSF adoption or vendor adoption of OCSF benefiting these people that you're working with? And on top of that, why in general should customers care about vendors adopting OCSF? Why does that matter to them? And maybe, Oliver, you just spoke. Maybe we'll have Jake, you start with this one.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? Vendor adoption is one of the most important things here, and because I've said this before, right? OCSF, it's a standard by vendors for vendors, and that's a good thing, because if we're talking about interoperability, if we're talking about customers with security data lakes, having a generalized and agreed upon standard is going to do two things. First is it's going to reduce the friction in building and maintaining those security data lakes. So it's easier for, say, analysts or threat hunters or incident response to find things, right? It's easier for data engineers to build things, and that's important because data engineering and cybersecurity, these are two very deep disciplines, and there's not a lot of overlap today in those fields, right? So we'll think about how, say, development and operations were several years ago. The rise of the public cloud, that encouraged this multidisciplinary concept of DevOps, right? And it's similar to how this current industry adoption of security data lakes, this is encouraging something similar with this almost security data engineering concept. But we're not there yet. There's not a lot of job postings out there that have security data engineering experience, right, as a requirement yet. And so all that's to say is that your engineer who's implementing or using a security data lake, they're either going to lean a little bit more toward security or a little bit more toward data. And becoming familiar with a single standard is just a lot easier for them than becoming familiar with, say, a dozen or 100 different sources that they're ingesting. As Oliver said, right, that maybe they can figure out that IP ADDR is the same as IP address, but when you have two different sources that the word audit could mean two different things, that's going to be a lot harder. That's going to require domain expertise as well. That's going to slow things down. That's going to introduce mistakes. The second thing is it allows the vendors themselves to interoperate with each other on the data level, right? Without necessarily needing to collaborate and work, wait for each other. So that means for the end user, less waiting for connectors, right? If a vendor accepts data in OCSF format, well, in theory, that means that integrations are as easy as self-service, or at a minimum, there's much more reduced time to development. And see, without that kind of promise, without that unified schema, you're going to need both vendors to possibly work together to maintain it, right? That's a long process. That's something that's probably only the biggest vendors that are non-competing and have a lot of customer asks are actually going to do. Or one of those parties is going to need to act unilaterally, which again, that's going to require expertise. That's not going to have those guarantees of stability that you're going to get with an accepted schema. And so OCSF, just by its very existence, allows those vendors to create those unilateral integrations with the guarantees of the schema at least being similar, right? So in a few words, right, how does this help our end users? Easier for the end user to manage, easier to work with, and more interoperability.
Amazing. Oliver, could you add your insights and thoughts there as well?
I mean, I think, it's interesting to note that, like, we can look at this in terms of just analytics or data, but actually I find that sometimes we seem to be over specialized in security. And I'll give you an example, right? If you look at job ads, people will ask you for a vendor. They will say, I don't know, I need you to know Qualys, not vulnerability assessment. OCSF is something similar to other standards which will allow user skills to be transferable. Right? It doesn't matter which SIEM you're using. If you understand OCSF, you're going to be able to do detection engineering, going to be able to search. You're going to have an understanding of how the data is structured. So I think that's a real benefit for the end users. It's also predictable for them. They don't, like, we spend a lot of time doing data wrangling and building parsers. They spend a lot of time having to relearn the same stuff on each tool anew because everyone uses their own language. So I think that's actually going to make it easier for them. As a consequence, it's all going to also make it easier for them to be able to, rip and replace solutions, right? If that's standardized, it's not as sticky, which, we know for vendors it's hard to let go, but I think the benefit is sufficient to justify that. And lastly, when it comes for me to the big thing is around detection engineering and analytics, I don't really want to have to engineer this for every single vendor anew. As an end user, right? If I'm basically doing my own rapid response detection engineering based off of an advisory or something, it would be nice to be able to just write it one way and execute it the same way everywhere. In the moment, we have an intermediate like Sigma, which acts like as a translator or a Zeta Stone. Like, we shouldn't need that. We should just need one way of doing it and finish.
Yeah, no, I've done my fair share of Sigma roles too. So But Yuval, I think, being the CTO of Hunters, and Hunters being a product that, ingests all kinds of security data and then has to run analytics on it, I imagine that you have some kind of unique insight and thoughts on the subject as far as like how a vendor adoption will help, customers and the people that we work with, and as well as, why they should care about this.
Yeah, for sure. So start with, I think a lot of great things have been said, both by Jake and Oliver. From my perspective, I try to look at it from the time to value we get our customers. And what I mean by that is when you have all these different vendors producing different data sources, the different types of schemas, then once you want to onboard these different schemas, you then have to learn, right? When I'm a security analyst and I want to start working with my SIEM solution, I first need to go through the step of learning what my data looks like. Is it IP_adder? Is it IP address, as Oliver and Jake talked about? And for me, I want to unblock that for the customer. And I start to think about, okay, what can I build on top of OCSF that would make life easier for my customers? So for example, searching on top of OCSF, right? If my customer knows how to search on top of OCSF, they get multiple things, right? They get an object structure, they get the security event with the context, right? For example, if I'm looking for the IP address or I'm looking for the agent or the process activity, I can do that pretty easily because the objects within OCSF would describe that for me, and I don't need to know the intrinsics. And then I can have a lot of things out of the box for my customers, like I can autocomplete that for them, and I can show them preview or hint them what type of fields they're looking for, right? And then I can get them to better understand what their data lake looks like and what the data within their data lake looks like without having to reason about all the intrinsics of the different vendor schemas. And I think one of the keys, Ian, as you said, is really adopting OCSF at the deepest level and having the entire infrastructure talk OCSF, so to say. Because if you think about it, not only if the data lake is structured on top of OCSF, can I have interesting, I can have better search capabilities on top of that, and I can look into my data and understand what's going on. I can also start, for example, if I'm writing a detection and I want to produce a security finding, right? And this security finding can later propagate to the different vendors and they can use that, for their advantage. So you can consume OCSF data, but also produce OCSF data. And I think that interoperability brings in a lot of power. And for the building blocks, right? So we talk a lot about, you guys shared your war stories about building parsers, right? Mm-hmm. Doing that at scale is a challenge. And what we see our customers coming into Hunters, one of the things they want us to solve for them is data ingestion, because that is a real pain for them, maintaining these parsers, understanding how to do things at scale, right? If I'm a company and I have 100,000 endpoints, right? And that means multiple terabytes of data a day. I need my security data engineers to know how to handle that type of scale. And that's not trivial. And if we have more and more of these security vendors produce OCSF, we're basically saving a lot of compute. Now, I know Jake might not be happy hearing that, but if we reduce the amount of compute that we're using, we can also give, better cost benefits to our customers who are using their SIEM products, which is important.
I actually am very happy to hear that. The more efficient we can get, the more, right? No matter what, I always like to say, we're not competing with whatever the expensive thing is. This is security. We're competing with doing nothing. So we gotta be efficient.
For sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, I mean, at a high level, I definitely understand. Like, OCSF is gonna, ideally going to make things a lot easier, less focus on kind of the trivial aspects of security and more focus on the actual security, context. Like what do I need to know from a security perspective, and what can I get out of my data from a security perspective? I think that's really, really powerful. That transition, Oliver, that you were talking about, of going from, having to become an expert on individual technologies to being an expert on different security data types, and then being able to build detections on that. Does a lot for me as an individual analyst, being able to take that information and travel amongst different companies as I go, and also as an industry to be able to build up a library of detections that maybe or analytics that aren't specific to one technology or specific to one vendor. I think that that serves the industry well as a whole. So, I mean, all super valuable points and really, really great. I think, well, kind of diving deeper into this, I'd love to get some very specific, tangible examples from each one of you and your own domain expertise. And also, I mean, this wouldn't be a 2024 webinar if we didn't talk about AI and, how this might affect, AI, or how AI might be able to leverage the idea of OCSF as well. So, Jake, maybe from a security data lake perspective, is there anything like a very specific, tangible example that you can think of that you've already seen or that you imagine, OCSF helping with?
Yeah, I can talk about something tangible. But what's tangible is that no customer that I've talked to date has leaned in 100% on OCSF, right? In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say no customer has gone in on any standard 100%, even outside of security. And I'm going to probably say that the vast majority of our customers, even, style conventions on how to name a table is probably a little bit too hard to get 100% on. So instead, what's kind of good about this schema is that it does not need it to be implemented everywhere, or even anywhere really to add value. So I've actually seen a customer avoid the spec entirely and just use the top the six top level categories, right, to sort their data and figure out their table structure when building their own security data lake. So they could say, yeah, we used OCSF. Really, they just went to the first page and copied the first row. But right, that's the flexibility. That's key, right? If you're operating a security data lake, you're going to have a lot of different types of data. Some is going to be in OCSF format. It's going to be security data. Some's going to be security data in another format. Again, if you're using Snowflake, you're going to have HR data, you're going to have finance data, you're going to possibly have some inventory data created by another team, managed by another team, but that's going to be useful for your investigations and for your enrichments. And so ingestion-wise, that means that I see a lot of customers, they're ingesting raw, they're using views. That's good because that normalization, that can then be done on demand only if needed, right? It makes it easier to, say, upgrade your version later and make tweaks. Right? And those other downstream teams like the ML team, they're going to get a lot of value out of the raw data rather than, let's just say, the detection engineering team. So if you're talking about detection engineering, right, my advice is always make sure you keep that, if you're going to transform in the pipeline, keep it raw as well. So that's what Hunters is doing, right? They're doing that transformation for you because they know you're going to need it because you're buying Hunters, your detection engineering, your detection engineers, right? But they're going to provide you that raw as well. Another way that we see kind of tangible use cases here is actually, and I'm going to say, I think I'm the first one to say it, AI. I'm probably the first one ever to use that and the word tangible in the same sentence as well. But a real world example, right? I talked to a customer and they told me, no, we don't care what standard we use, but we chose OCSF instead of rolling our own because that spec is really well documented and we were able to just feed it into the LLM, have it write those views, have it write those tests to normalize my data. And of course, that's going to work the other way around as well, right? Once that data is normalized, an LLM is going to have a lot easier time querying it, right? Knowing what those fields mean, making sense of those to write those detections, to write those ad hoc investigative queries.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I don't think I've ever thought of somebody using OCSF as like a guideline and, not necessarily using the spec, but just using it to separate the data and figure out like, how should I even think about my data? That's a really interesting example. I mean, so you're not reinventing the wheel and trying to figure out what categories should be. Hey, look, they've already done it. They've categorized it. Maybe I don't want to use the spec, but of course we'd like to see them use the spec. The more people that adopt it, the more portable things will be, but still. And then that's a super interesting use case. And then the notion of using views also, allowing you to be able to make changes to the way that you're parsing the data and viewing it on the fly without having to rebuild all your tables is super valuable. So super great insight. Love hearing that from the Snowflake perspective. Oliver, from your experience just touching lots of different customers with lots of different technology, like what do you think are some tangible examples, and also any insights you have on AI as well in relation to OCSF?
I mean, so I spend a fair amount of time just in the MSSP space, and the big challenge there is basically having diverse technologies. You have a very customer base. You have to deliver the same SLAs for all of them, regardless of what state the data is in. And most of all, though, is that if you really want to leverage economies of scale and synergies, you can't treat these customers in isolation. You have to look at them as an aggregate whole. You see something in one customer, you can then search for it in someone else's, right? OCSF makes that much, much easier. You're not spending the time trying to translate one vendor to another. It's already done for you. You're basically comparing apples for apples. The second area, and this is a little bit more obscure, but actually incredibly important, if you want to basically do machine learning based analysis of security data, you need to do basically what's called tokenization, right? We all know this from LLMs. Basically, they break up a text by the words. It's not enough in security. What I mean, because what you need is actually, you need context around that. I'll give you an example, PowerShell. PowerShell has fields where the commands matter. You basically want your taxonomy or whatever, your analytics to know these are the range of commands. But when you're looking at username, you want every character turned into basically a numerical representation in the vector. OCSF enables you to do that standardized across all data types. An IP address is an IP address everywhere. Rather than having to do this on an individual basis, you can do it across all data sources. And that's a huge boon if you're basically developing machine learning models, because you can spend your time on analytics, not on data wrangling. You're turning that equation around, because a lot of effort goes into working out, but it sounds so easy, right? We just build a parser. No, you have to work out how you're going to parse it, what format you're going to get it into the end. It's a lot of effort. And if you don't have experience in it, it's actually not very easy. You can make a mistake that will cost you later on. So this solves that problem. It takes away that whole needing to work that out from scratch for anybody developing analytics or machine learning models, which makes them portable. That's the interesting thing. Now I can develop a model and I can give it to you to use. It's not custom to me anymore because we have a data standard. It means it works anywhere.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the MSSP thing is pretty interesting as well. You know, the all important SLA, super important for the MSSPs to be able to make good on the SLAs that they provide for all the different detections and alerts that they produce. But also, as a customer, as a customer of an MSSP, I can feel more confident that they're going to be able to respond and have that expertise across data if it's being normalized to OCSF for the same reasons that we talked about before. I don't have to worry that they've never seen data from this vendor before. If it's a data that's encompassed by OCSF, we know the data is going to be in that format, which, helps. You're putting a lot of trust in an MSSP, and you're, transferring a lot of risk to them. And so the idea of, having that data standard to make you feel more comfortable because that expertise translates is really kind of an interesting one that I hadn't thought about before. But, that's, is someone that deals with all kinds of MSSPs. That's great insight. And then it's just funny to hear that the AI and ML people are dealing with the same data wrangling problems that I've been dealing with for the past 5+ years. Sitting up in their ivory tower of AI and ML, they still got to deal with the same problems that I've been dealing with.
Bad data in, bad data out, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but at Snowflake we don't have ivory towers. Everyone's on a budget and gets.
There you go. And then Yuval, again, I think just kind of getting your idea of what it means in relation to what you see in the industry as far as any kind of tangible examples there, and then how it might affect AI as well.
Yeah, so I think both examples from Jake and Oliver were great. I mean, from the perspective of what Jake talked about having views on top of your raw data, if anyone from our audience is contributing or following the OCSF community, V1.2 was just released, and we already have deprecations of old schemas that we produced in 1.0. And for anyone who's doing detection engineering in masses on top of schema knows how challenging it is to move your data and evolve your detections as fast as your schema is evolving. So I think, views give you that flexibility on top of your raw data. And I think that's something that's one of the challenges. Maybe we'll talk about that later. That's going to be, with us as the schema evolves. We're going to want our OCSF schema to be at the latest version and be up to date and produce the most up to date, attributes and events, etc. So it's going to be interesting to see how the community is going to deal with it. In terms of AI, as Oliver said, people look at it as ivory tower, but if anyone who has done some machine learning knows how much time is spent on producing a quality data set. Because your data set, if your data set is not great, then your model is not going to be performing great. And you need to be, you're working and churning at that, and it takes time. And so I think OCSF in terms of that is a great ground for our models to need, for standardizing them. OCSF speaks the language of security. So we're giving them the context that Oliver was talking about, right? We're talking about hosts, and we're talking about processes, and we're talking about network connections. It's already in the model. So it makes the training of your model a bit easier to do. And, with all the great existing open source models that we have today, we're seeing like experimenting with the RAG approach, right? Where we're augmenting an existing model with more context and more data. And I think when we do that, and we do that using OCSF, I think, as Oliver talked about, we're going to make that transferable. We're going to be able to say, hey, this is the model. This is my RAG model. Here, go ahead. You can use this and leverage it within your internal scheme. I think that's super powerful. And I think that's one of the things OCSF is about, right? Creating that community, like a true community around OCSF, and opening up, the vendor locking that we've been experiencing. I think it's a real important stepping stone for us as a security community.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sure many people are happy about the idea of not being vendor locked anymore, because I think almost anyone who's dealt with any kind of security data or any kind of data in the past has definitely felt the pains of that before. So if I heard you correctly, though, it sounds like, OCSF is kind of acting like a interpretation layer, in the sense that, like, you could have just dumb data and, you have to draw your own inferences for it, or you have OCSF, which kind of already has that security context built into it, and it provides like pre-identified relationships between that data, like kind of how they could potentially map together, which makes training your models, makes all of that much, much easier than just trying to develop that without having any context at all. So that's great. And then I think the kind of the last question that I have for everyone here is just OCSF is pretty new. And we talked about a lot of like the really great benefits and where we were before, kind of the dark ages before OCSF existed. And, we're at the very beginning of like the adoption curve, I think, for this. We're starting to see it pick up. But, is there anything, missing today that could help with that adoption? And what do you think's needed to kind of really, take it to like, the next level and really make it the de facto standard for everyone everywhere? And I'll, again, I'll leave that open for everyone. Just, whoever wants to jump in first, go ahead.
I have some thoughts. Let's have the architect critique things. No, but actually, it's thing is, right, it's still relatively new, but it's getting a lot better. But there still is a level of incompleteness. So I'll give an example. We dive into the spec. Every category has this unmapped field where if something doesn't fit, you'll put it in there. And a lot of sources and a lot of vendors will use that a lot. So I'm going to pick on AWS, right? They're one of the key contributors to this. And CloudTrail still has a lot of unmapped fields. But like I said, it's gotten better, right? 6 months ago, there were twice as many. Now they've reduced that down a lot. But this has gotten better. And one of the reasons it's also gotten better is because of this very welcoming community, where if a vendor wants to implement something, they go on the Slack, they talk about it, it gets done. There's not a lot of gatekeeping. I remember when I was actually during Hunter's early stage, one of your colleagues reached out to me, said, "Hey, could we talk about this? Who could we talk about this with?" And I found somebody, and I pinged them and I said, "Hey, would you want to talk to Hunter's? They I don't know if you consider them a competitor." They said, "Yeah, it doesn't matter. We're talking OCSF here. Let's work this out for the good of the whole community." And so that actually was one of those things I think is really going to drive this forward. But going back to the complaining, right, there's also this issue with versioning, and this is not unique to OCSF. This is every single standard, even if it's not even a standard, just one company doing it, right? This thing launched in beta, and when it did, there was a lot of fanfare and a lot of vendors launched their integrations to that beta spec. So back in the day, not that far back in the day, a lot of unmapped fields. Then this thing hit the 1.0, and a lot of these integrations are still right? Unsupported. No one's really maintained it. They kind of did it for the publicity, but they're waiting. They're waiting for more customers to ask about this. The thing is, though, that's not necessarily the biggest issue because, right, we can always remap it, right? And something is always better than nothing. But again, maintenance and maintaining is always something to consider, especially in an open standard where there isn't, right? If we're talking, there isn't someone just that has that tight control over the schema, and when you really do need to rely on a community. By the way, what that's going to lead to forks. That's going to lead to, and that's exactly what customers are doing now. You're going to end up with a lot of dialects of OCSF, but again, that's not a bad thing either, right? The schema is going to evolve. It's going to get more and more mature because of these companies forking and then bringing it back in. And of course, as the schema gets more mature, right, those unknown fields are going to decrease. The deviations are going to decrease over time as well. Again, that's all good for the community. Like you've all mentioned, right? That community is key. So short story is I think those things are minor, maybe not minor, but they are, technical hurdles. The main thing that this schema is going to need is adoption, right? We need more people asking for it. If the vendors do it, customers are going to get used to it, and they're going to ask more vendors to implement it. It's a feedback loop, right? And so, in my opinion, the thing that's really going to make or break this, it's going to be, that momentum. How quickly are vendors responding to it? How loudly are customers asking for it and implementing it themselves? And that momentum is what I think is really going to just drive this thing.
So it sounds like a little bit like what you're saying is that it's incumbent upon the customers as well as the vendors, but upon the customers to kind of demand that their vendors start supporting it. And as the vendors start supporting it, more and more customers will ask for it, and it'll kind of create this feedback loop. So, any customers out there, ask your vendors to support OCSF. It'll benefit the whole community. I think that's a really important key takeaway there. And Yuval, I'm going to kind of switch to you specifically because of the things that Jake was mentioning. You talked about like evolving standards and adopting something and having it change. And I wonder if you have some specific insight on that, and if that dovetails into any of the things that you think might affect adoption or is affecting adoption today.
Yeah, so I think we at Hunters, we've built before OCSF our internal model, so we have a lot of experience on what it means to build a model and evolve it. And I think we're going to be experiencing similar challenges within the OCSF community, as Jake said, evolving a schema, evolving detections. It's something that takes time. You write a detection, you have a thesis, you test it, right? You run it, you see how it works on your data. And then, things change, the network topology, it's a dynamic thing, right? So you then go back and you fix it. And it's an iterative process that we'll need to go through, right? And companies, and people will need to pay the tax to evolve their schema to the better version or the newer version. It's part of life. And we just need to figure out how to do it in the most seamless way and backwards compatible way, something that doesn't break when we modify it and when we have, the new future version. And I think, another key aspect to OCSF, and Jake actually has an interesting blog on that when he wrote about OCSF, is how we encode OCSF within our security data lakes, right? So for those of you who are not aware, OCSF as a standard still doesn't have an encoding scheme, right? So when you take a schema and you write it into your data lake, you need to decide, okay, what's the format? How do I store this data on disk, right? There's no like on disk today. We store everything in blob storage, but how does it look? Like, how do I then query it? And since, we're still in the early days of this discussion, we see different people going different routes, and it's going to be interesting because the fact that OCSF is modeled in an object-oriented kind of way implicitly means that there's a lot of nesting within data structure, etc. And we'll need our data lakes, to naturally support querying on these objects. So right now we're having a lot of conversation around that in the OCSF community around what's the best way to encode it. How do I encode OCSF to technical things like Parquet files, right, or C files, etc. And what that schema looks like there. And I think making sure that the standard is defined for encoding as well is going to be like really critical for us going forward in that sense. And I think as Jake said and Oliver said, I think the most important thing, there were security schemas before, right? As Oliver said, there was Ceph, there was ECS, there was SIEM. Many protocols came before. I think the openness and the community around it, and if we get vendors, and I think this is part of why we're doing this webinar. We want to raise awareness. We want to say, hey, there's this new schema. It's a thing. It's out there. Use it. Explore it. It's really nice. It has great potential to unlock integrations between different security vendors. We want you to be out there. We want you to be demanding it. And I think the more vendors push, OCSF data and produce OCSF data and are engaged within the community around what the schema is and how it evolves, and a lot of the different vendors can really, bring their experience. One is producing vulnerability data, one is producing detection data, one is producing, network data, one is producing endpoint data. These people have lots of experience, and it's super, super important that they contribute to the conversation. And I think that's going to be like the deciding factor if OCSF becomes this de facto standard in the future.
Yeah, I think that dovetails nicely into Oliver, your thoughts. You are someone who views the industry as a whole and sees lots of different companies trying to adopt this, or vendors trying to adopt it, customers trying to adopt it. What do you think is needed to kind of take it to the next level here?
So I agree with both Yuval and Jake, the fact that we need vendors to go all in, right? We can't have someone just translating between their own data model and OCSF, because they will always just extend it. We need them to think in OCSF, because if too many people add their own custom stuff, somebody needs to be there to say, actually, we could unify this. This can be standardized. Like, standards need to be maintained, to say it really bluntly, And if you do it on a voluntary basis, that's harder to do. I think that's a thing to keep in mind. So that's the one thing. The other thing I think, though, is that like right now it's like a dictionary of data types. There's a basic taxonomy. What we're not sharing yet are things like ontologies. What we're not sharing yet is that secondary level of like almost like meta interpretation of what you can do with it, which will help us to build a lot more portable analytics and portable machine learning models as well. There's certain data, and if you think about sharing synthetic data as well in OCSF, there are further steps to be done for us to integrate this as an industry and to make sure that it does become a unified language. Right now, it's a little bit, I think, sprinkled on in some cases, and we need it to just to be, wholeheartedly embraced. It needs to become the DNA almost.
Yeah, it's funny. I worked in healthcare software for the first 10 years of my career, and there was a data standard, HL7, that was designed for interoperability between different healthcare organizations. And you mentioned something that kind of stuck to me is kind of that meta layer of being able to interpret the data. So not just having like a set of fields that exists and could maybe be interpreted different ways, but that second level of like how you're supposed to interpret the data at each one of these different, each one of these different schemas, super important. And it was a very similar struggle with the healthcare portability data. It's like, well, this field means this, and I could interpret it a variety of different ways, and without having that kind of agreed upon interpretation, it does hold it back a little bit. So I think great point. And definitely something that I've seen in other industries, and also seen it overcome too. So I think we can do that here. Last is just closing thoughts. And Yuval, I thought I might start with you. One thing that was brought up, and I know Hunters is a contributor to the OCSF GitHub, the project itself. But I was wondering, we talked a lot about like vendors needing to adopt OCSF, and one thing that came up was, as the standard changes, that means that, people need to change. Like, for instance, the Hunters detections would have to change. And I'm wondering if, beyond just agreeing on the schema, are anyone in the OCSF group, are they working on, as vendors, like, how do we accommodate these changes? Like, what are the best practices, or how do we work, how do we make this work so that as the schema changes and updates, we're able to make those changes quickly in each one of the different products?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think we're not there yet in terms of like community discussions about it. As people slowly start to embrace it, I think it's like it's a V2 problem, right? We're gonna build those analytics, and then I think we're all going to start feeling that struggle of, okay, So V2 came out. How do I migrate, right? How do I evolve my detections? And I think it ties back to what Oliver said around ontology and building analytics on top of it. If we have shared analytics, then I can, as a contributor to the community, create, I can use AI magically to sprinkle this migrator from V1 to V2, right? It can help me do that. And then I can be like very effective in how I help the community migrate from V1 to V2. So I think the shared story here is going to be like really interesting in how we overcome and solve these challenges. There's really, there's no easy way with schema migrations. There's no silver bullet there. It's just, work that we're going to need to do. And we're going to need to create the tooling around that as a community to make sure it's, least resistant, and make it not be something that we're shining away from. And we're like, oh, I don't want to do this. I will be forever in V1. We need to create these tools to help, the community get past these as we progress in schemas.
Yeah, amazing. And Oliver and Jake, any closing thoughts before we switch over to some questions that we have from the audience?
I guess one last thing is just like I completely agree with you. Like right now we're exchanging data. We need to use this as a basis to exchange knowledge. And I think generally that just means us formalizing stuff. And then, I saw there was a question come up around ECS and OCSF and which one's better. It doesn't matter. They're good for slightly different things. What matters is that now we have maybe 3 or 4 standards rather than 30 or 40 standards, which is much better. I think it's easier. I wouldn't want to pick one over the other. They have pros and cons, but it is that kind of every incremental improvement saves us time where we're getting little ROI. And I think that's the important thing. And the further we can progress here, the more we can standardize, we can turn this into reusable building blocks that when everyone doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, the easier it's going to get for us as an industry and allow us to focus on ultimately stopping, threat actors, not getting data into shape.
Jake, any last comments from you before we go to questions?
Sure. I mean, look, closing thought for me is I'm very bullish on OCSF as a standard. I'm bullish on ECS as well. I mean, to Yuval's point, right? If something's in OCSF or ECS, okay, convert from one to the other. Like that's not like you're converting 170 sources here to 170 there. That's a one-off. That's not. OCSF is a big community. That translator is probably maintainable by a person or two, right? And I think you're gonna see that people are gonna have multiple things and standards in their data lakes. That's not a bad thing, right? If we're talking about ECS for a second, they were closed, run by Elastic, got donated to Open Telemetry. Open Telemetry, I'm not sure what the progress is on that, but I know they've been working on merging those two standards together, right? So it's possible in a year from now, ECS is going to be just a subset of Open Telemetry, which in the observability space is the standard, right? And so this is the good thing, right? It's not an either or. It's we're going to have both, right? You're going to have you're going to have more logs normalized. You're going to have things that interoperate better, and that's a good thing. And I think that this is here for a while, right? Security data lakes are going to be here for a while. I think the economic factors that made them feasible to begin with, right? Those ever increasing amounts of data, continuous creation of these new regulations, right? And this need for faster, better, more private reporting within your security perimeter. That means that every day, right, security is becoming more and more of a data problem. And when a lot of people are doing a lot of new things, those standards, that's when we start to see these standards. That's when they become more desirable. That's when we start to see more people asking for them, demanding them of those vendors as well. And I know that Snowflake, right, we're going to be continuing to support it as long as our customers, as long as our partners are. So, I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this whole community grows.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and thank you everybody for your insights there. I'm going to go ahead and move over to
one thing before we go to questions. I just want to say to the ECS question. So I think I try to imagine the OCSF building like as ECS was to Elastic. I want to imagine that OCSF could also be for the security data lake approach, because there's a lot of things that are similar in terms of, like, if you think about indexing, then, for example, OCSF has this notion of observables. And observables are these things that you put in place, right, when you want to search your IOC specific data, right? And then, for example, you'd put like IPs, host names, hashes in there, and they're available for fast queries within your data lake. And the data lakes today have like several approaches on how to run queries against that very effectively. So I see that. I think there's some binding trend between security data lake and OCSF also in terms of like people and how they're adopting them. It's going to be interesting to see. And one less shameless plug. If you are at RSA or attending RSA, there's going to be an OCSF breakfast in there. So which Hunters is one of the sponsors, and I'll be there, and I'll just be happy to talk to anyone who wants to, chat about it, chat about security data lakes, talk about OCSF and how it's evolving. Be glad to meet our attendees there.
I'll be there as well, and I'll be happy to direct you to Yuval to have those conversations. No, I'm just kidding. I'm happy to talk to you guys as well. But the couple of questions that we had, and I know we don't have a ton of time here, so we're going to go through a few of them. But one of them was kind of an interesting one. Is there any open data sets of cybersecurity data in OCSF? And I'm assuming that's maybe to help just see an example of what it looks like, and how you might start interpreting that data. Do you guys know of any open data sets like that might exist?
I believe there's some in the documentation on the GitHub. It's not a large data set, but there are some examples. Honestly, I just write my own. I take my logs and I go to GPT and I say, hey, write me a view for OCSF. So if anyone listening is a Snowflake customer and wants example data to play with, I'm more than happy to work with them to create it.
Yeah, I love, there's also, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
If you're an AWS customer by chance, so AWS has this notion of security data lake, and then they publish, there's like currently about 36 producers that support OCSF. So you could potentially create a security data lake and then click to enable them, and then you will get OCSF data into your security data lake or S3 buckets, and then you can start by analyzing it. But it's not an open thing. I'm currently not aware of like an open data set, but I think that's a great idea for the community to discuss regarding how do we create these examples, how do we enhance the repositories to be more open for people to learn on how I operate, how I query, how I read OCSF data.
Yeah, for sure. I always like having data samples myself whenever I'm testing things internally or just for fun. Okay, so I think we answered this question already, but I think it's an important one. It's like, what do you think that the pivot point could be where OCSF is used by default to generate events by security industry? So, I mean, the difference is like not doing an interpretation, not translating things to OCSF, but just natively, like I, as an EDR vendor, I'm going to emit data in OCSF standard, or as AWS or anything else. Like, I think we are there in some cases, but maybe not fully there for a lot of vendors. So, any thoughts on that beyond what we might have already shared?
I actually don't think we're ever going to get there, and I don't think we need to. I think that there are certain vendors. So Hunters is a great example where, yes, it pays to think in OCSF. We're writing threat detections here. But so a lot of what I do is I work with other companies that are processing security data, right? And readability is all of a sudden a non-issue once you hit a certain scale. And so those companies are always going to be translating in and translating out because their internal thing is not even readable by their own engineers. So I think where we hit that pivot point is going to be naturally over time. When a new company says, how am I going to export this data? That's when you're at the best opportunity to say it's going to be OCSF. Switching is hard. Right? Switching is hard if customers aren't begging for it, especially if they can also just bring it in and convert it on their own. Especially as the industry of security data tooling, right? If you who knows, maybe in a couple of years we'll all have separate security ETL tools, and those will do all the mappings. So the pivot point is going to depend on which direction the industry takes. And I think as you see more and more startups, more and more new companies, more and more modern SIMs, that's when you're going to start to see more and more adoption.
Great. And I appreciate that. I want to be cognizant of time here. Oliver, I don't mean to cut you off. I think we have about 5 minutes left. So I want to turn it back over to our hosts here and, thank everybody for their time and expertise. And, I've enjoyed this conversation thoroughly. So really great to get all of your insights. But yeah, we'll turn it back over and kind of let us close out this webinar here. And again, thanks everybody and for all attendees and all of our presenters as well.
Thanks, Ian, Oliver, Yuval, and Jake for a great presentation. That's all the time we have today. Please join me in thanking Oliver, Yuval, and Jake for their presentations as well as our sponsor, Hunters. I also wanted to remind you that we'd love your feedback in our webinar survey to help improve our programs. If you have additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click the Email Us button on the console. Please visit securitymagazine.com for the archive of this presentation as well as information about our upcoming events. We appreciate your time and hope you have found this webinar to be a valuable experience.